Worcester, Massachusetts' second largest city, often flies underneath the radar. Outside of the New England region, not many people are familiar with the city. The intriguing central Massachusetts city has a rich history and a unique underworld. Let's explore the dark corners in the heart of the Commonwealth. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Today we're going to discuss one of the most overlooked cities in Massachusetts. When most people from outside the region think of the Bay State, usually the Boston metro area is what comes to mind. A lot of people don't realize that's just a small portion of the actual Commonwealth. When the media talks about crime or street organizations, it usually focuses on the deadly inner-city neighborhoods of Boston or even the dangerous city of Springfield in Western Mass. Worcester, which is Massachusetts and really all of New England's second largest city population-wise, is often left out of the conversation entirely. It certainly isn't because this activity doesn't exist in the city. Going back decades into the 20th century, there have been notorious homegrown crews along with sets of nationally syndicated street organizations in Worcester. One organization in particular I've never heard of existing anywhere else in the Commonwealth besides Worcester. That's until somewhat recently they've also set up shop in New Bedford. Worcester declares itself as the heart of the Commonwealth, which is a fair description in my opinion. It sits right in the middle geographically of Massachusetts. Now, many people consider anything west of Boston Western Mass, but Central Mass has its own unique characteristics and somewhat of a distinct accent, similar to how Springfield's accent is completely different than the Boston one. Not all Massachusetts accents are the same. Besides Fitchburg, Leominster, and Gardner to the north, Worcester is surrounded by a lot of small, rural, and old mill towns. West of the city, the landscape begins to change dramatically, with cities becoming less and less frequent. Worcester technically is where the Boston metro area ends in the west. Interstates 90 and 290 go right through the city and connect to the massive Interstate 495. The city is also part of the largest metro area in New England, between Boston, Providence, Rhode Island, and Worcester. This city has an incredible geographic location, being 40 miles west of Boston, 38 miles northwest of Providence, Rhode Island, and only 50 miles east of Springfield. Thanks to its prime geography, Worcester grew in size during the 20th century. And seeing how you guys have been enjoying the history aspect of most of my videos, let's take a look at how Worcester got to where it is today. Worcester was first settled in 1673 and was referred to as, bear with me guys, Quinsigamond, which is the native word for the place. The town had to be briefly abandoned during King Philip's War when warring native tribes were attacking English settlements on the western frontier, which is what Worcester was at that time. Then a second attempt in 1701 to settle the area also failed, but here's when the settlement was named Worcester, meaning war castle in Old English. A third and final attempt came in 1713, and then finally in 1722 Worcester became incorporated as a town. Soon after, in 1731, Worcester became the shire town or county seat for the aptly named Worcester County. The town continued to grow, and one of Worcester's early claims to fame was in July of 1776 when a man named Isaiah Thomas was the first person to publicly read the Declaration of Independence to a crowd in the town. Worcester had one major problem early on when it was trying to grow though. In a time when things could only be transported overland by horse and carriage, most things were shipped by boat. Worcester's landlocked location put the city at a disadvantage. That's until in 1825, some forward-thinking entrepreneurs got together and came up with some ideas to grow the city and turn it into an industrial and manufacturing hub. At this time, most freight was transported from place to place by ship. Most large cities were either located on the ocean or a large river or lake. Before the wide-scale use of railroads and automobiles, this is how everyday goods were transported. They decided to connect Worcester with the nearby city of Providence, Rhode Island, which was only 38 miles southeast via the man-made Blackstone Canal. The canal ultimately did very little to help increase Worcester's industrial production, but it was a huge move in the right direction for the town. It showed that Worcester's leaders were serious about industrializing the city and putting it on the map. 7 years later, in 1835, the first railroads between Boston and Worcester opened. This is what really changed the fortunes for Worcester. The travel time was cut down by 4 hours between the two cities. Once the rail line connected Worcester and Boston together in the mid-1830s, the town's industry and population began to boom. Worcester would go on to leave its mark in the history of the manufacturing world. Worcester, shortly after being connected to Boston via the railroad in the 1830s, became a manufacturing hub in the 1840s. Many mechanics-based manufacturing operations began to operate in the city. In 1831, Ichabod Washburn's wire-making firm was created, which became the largest in the nation. He created a new revolutionary wire drawing process. Then in 1840, the monkey wrench was invented by the Coase brothers in Worcester. A few years later, in 1843, Charles Thuber unveiled the first typewriter to the world. This was obviously a revolutionary invention and changed daily life for many people. As industry began to grow in the mid-19th century, so did Worcester's population, and it was incorporated as a city in 1848. In 1857, Mechanics Hall opened and it showed the growing social influence that manufacturers had in Worcester during this time period, mixing in with societal elites. Worcester was even referred to as the paradise for mechanics during this time period. Due to the growing manufacturing industry in the city, its population began to boom. Many Irish first came to the city to work on the construction of the Blackstone Canal in 1829, and throughout the late 1800s, many French Canadians came to Worcester to work in the manufacturing factories. But around the turn of the 20th century is when the majority of immigrants began to pour into the city to work for its many manufacturing companies. The first main wave of immigrants to come to Worcester in the mid 1800s were mostly Irish, French Canadians, Swedish. There was also a decent sized number of German and English Canadians as well. Between 1890 and 1910, huge waves of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, also the Middle East, began to settle in the city. This included Polish, Lithuanian, Greek, Turkish, Syrian, and Lebanese peoples. In this 20-year period, Worcester's population skyrocketed from around 50,000 residents to over 118,000, turning it from a medium-sized city to a large one. It was during this time period that many of these manufacturing companies built triple-deckers all over the city to house its growing number of residents and workers. The first triple-decker was built in the city in 1858, either on John Street or Endicott Street. Soon there would be over 13,000 triple-deckers in the city, most of them centered around the Vernon Hill and Grafton Hill neighborhoods. After about 1936, they would stop being built in the city. I have always loved and been fascinated by triple-deckers. I loved hearing my dad talk about the city tearing a lot of the old ones down in Lynn when I was a kid. Triple-deckers are a very uniquely New England thing. In 1914, the cost of buying a triple-decker was around $3,000. To build one cost $900 for the carpentry, $500 for plumbing, $300 for the interior and exterior painting. Each door cost $2.83. So you can make about a $1,000 profit off a triple-decker if you built one and sold it. There were 7 distinct styles of triple-deckers: Italianate, Mansard, Early Queen Anne, Late Queen Anne, Early Classic Revival, Gambrel, and if you guessed right, Late Classic Revival. By the early 1900s, many people in Worcester were beginning to dislike the triple-deckers, calling them tenements. In 1912, the Worcester Board of Trade called them unattractive and a nuisance, even going as far as to call it a scourge, even a menace to life itself. It's a bit dramatic, but they also presented a very real fire risk, though. Like I said, many of these triple-deckers were built specifically to house workers for the different manufacturing companies. Like Chandler and Vernon Hill were often wire workers at Washburn and Moen Northworks, and in South Worcester there were machinists at Crompton and Knowles Loomworks. Union Hill were leather workers at Grafton and Knight. West Boylston Street in Greendale had Norton Company employees residing there. By 1981, there were only about 4,239 triple-deckers left in the city. In 1985, a story came out referring to them as beautiful, and prices skyrocketed from around $45,000 to $99,000 in just 5 years. Surprisingly, you can still get a triple-decker in the city for $226,891. You can't even get a 100-foot square condo in Gloucester for under $500K anymore, so that's kind of astounding to me. Many of the metalworking and woodworking machine companies produce large numbers of skilled machinists. Many of these skilled workers would frequently start up their own new companies after years on the job, creating what is referred to as the Worcester family tree of machine tool firms. Beyond being the main manufacturer of machine tools, wire products, and power looms, Worcester has some other historical inventions. In 1879, the commercial valentine industry was created out of a stationery store when Jonathan Taft's son Edward linked up with Esther Howland and began making valentine cards. Also in 1926, Robert Goddard launched a rocket powered by liquid fuel. He was one of the first scientists to explore the potential of rocket power and was a pioneer in the evolution of space travel. The city of Worcester continued to grow and prosper through the 1920s until the Great Depression hit. After World War II ended, the industry of the city began to steadily decline throughout the rest of the 20th century. So I almost forgot to mention when I was talking about some of the great inventions in the city of Worcester, the person who invented the little classic smiley face, the yellow smiley face with just the line in the eyes, it was this guy named Harvey Ball, and it was 1963. The guy was actually from Worcester who created the smiley face. So that's just another interesting fact that you'll only learn on the Jason Trimmins channel. Also, I'm using this light that, shout out my buddy David, who's a filmmaker. He's been following me around and filming me clam digging and stuff. He's putting together a little documentary style movie. But if I haven't said anything about it, I'm kind of trying to keep it under wraps. I'm a little shy about it. But he gave me this really nice light because before this I could only film myself on the computer here in the daytime with the daylight, because otherwise it would be really grainy and the quality would be bad because I'm not even using a camera when I do this. So I can do this at night now, which makes it a lot easier because sometimes, I can only do this stuff at night. So cool. After World War II, many cities began building large housing developments for returning veterans and their young families. This is where the model for the infamous projects of the 20th century comes from. My father originally lived in the old Columbia Point projects in Dorchester in the 1950s before they moved to Lynn because my grandfather was an Army veteran. In 1950, the city of Worcester built 2 large housing projects on the north side of the city. There's many housing projects throughout the city, but these are 2 notorious ones. The Curtis Apartments, a 372-unit development built on Great Brook Valley Ave, and the gigantic Great Brook Valley Gardens with over a dozen giant brick barrack-style buildings housing over 3,000 apartments. The GBV Gardens is by far the largest housing project in the city. Great Brook Valley, the Valley, or as my first cellie in Milton called it, Tacoma, is one of the most notorious hoods in Worcester. Before I even knew what GBV was, I knew from my cellie that Tacoma had the fattest bags in the city apparently. The neighborhood was basically a giant blighted area back in the day. The vast majority of the neighborhood's adults were unemployed, crime was out of control along with narcotics and gangs, firefighters and first responders refused to enter the valley without police protection, and even still to this day many restaurants refuse to deliver to the neighborhood. By the late 1970s, police wanted nothing to do with the valley, especially large housing developments like GBV Gardens and the Curtis Apartments. So Worcester, like many other cities, created a housing police force to patrol the projects in 1978. Only a year later, in June of 1979, 2 housing police officers pulled over a car that had a kitchen stove hanging out of its trunk. By the late 1970s, many of the valley's residents were Latino. While the projects had originally been built for returning veterans and their families, by the 70s the demographics had shifted dramatically. This caused a breakdown in communication between the authorities and the residents of the valley. While one of the officers was bringing the stove to the station, the officer on the scene began to argue with the handcuffed detainee. The man was complaining that the police were harassing him and he didn't appreciate it. As the argument escalated, the officer drew his weapon and fatally blasted the defenseless handcuffed man in the head. Residents were shocked and outraged by this aggressive act of violence. 3 days of rioting followed, where businesses and residents were vandalized and burnt to the ground. Police and locals clashed violently for days in the streets. The officer, who I might add was also Latino and not white, was eventually sentenced to 6 years for the heinous crime. Pretty light sentence in my opinion. The housing police disbanded a short time later, but the damage was done as far as the valley goes. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Great Brook Valley became one of the absolute worst areas in the city of Worcester. Crime, narcotics, gangs, women walking the streets were all prevalent during this time period. There were many buildings in the neighborhood that were burnt out with all the windows smashed. There was trash everywhere on the streets. The fire department was constantly having to come and put out out-of-control barrel fires that homeless or people out on the streets had started. A notorious homegrown Latino gang was created in GBV, I believe sometime in the 1990s. The GBV outlaws are not connected to the infamous 1%er biker club in any way, and I don't believe they're connected to the mostly Latino gang out of the Merrimack Valley cities like Lawrence and Haverhill, calling themselves the outlaws as well, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Just look at these pictures of these 2 guys circa 2007. You know they had that good tan H back in the day. That picture gives me a flashback. These guys look exactly like the guys I first started buying from. Over the years, the city has tried hard to clean up the Great Brook Valley neighborhood in an attempt to fix its terrible reputation. The streets of the area are noticeably cleaner and there's less criminal activity visible on the surface. Just this past summer, the city began to tear down the infamous 372-unit Curtis Apartments on GBV Avenue. The renovation is part of a $178 million redevelopment of the projects. It's a start in the right direction, but from what I read, the larger GBV Gardens is in need of some desperate TLC as well. Residents complain about cancer causing asbestos in the 75-year-old complex, massive rodent and cockroach infestations, inadequate heating so bad that many residents have to turn on their stove at 3 or 4 in the morning because they can't sleep because it's so cold. Residents also claim that the water is discolored and so dirty that many people refuse to give their young children baths, wiping them down with sanitary wipes instead. They also claim that there's sewer backups in the basement that go unnoticed by the housing authority, making many buildings reek of raw sewage. Of course, the Worcester Housing Authority denies all these claims. So before I go any further in the video where I start to discuss different hoods, alliances, and rivalries in Worcester, I need to speak on Italian organized crime in the city. Like most large cities in New England or just the Northeast in general, there was an Italian LCN presence in Worcester. Even though Providence, Boston, and even Springfield, Mass. Get way more press as far as organized crime goes, Worcester was still an important piece of the puzzle. The mysterious Frank Iacone ran Worcester for the Genovese family in the post-Depression era. A young hoodlum, Raymond Patriarca, who I might add was actually born in Worcester, even though he's known for being from Providence, Rhode Island, he was born in Worcester, would link up with Iacone early on in his criminal career. It was through Iacone that Raymond was able to get the blessings of the 5 families and take over the New England Borgata. The actual ceremony happened just outside of Worcester. After Iacone, another low-key mobster named Carlo Mastrototoro ran Worcester through the Genovese family as a capo. It's kind of strange that the Connecticut River was the boundary of the Patriarchs and the Genovese, giving the city of Springfield to New York, so technically Worcester was part of Raymond's territory, but it was always run by a Genovese crew. They must have just paid tribute to Raymond or something. I'm honestly not sure how it worked. Carlo passed away at the age of 89 in 2009. Not so often talked about is the fact that Carlo was a World War II hero, earning a Purple Heart and a Silver Star as a Marine in the Pacific Theater. Now back to the Great Brook Valley. So the GBV Outlaws, a mostly Latino gang, had major smoke with probably the most notorious gang to ever come out of Worcester, Kilby Street. Kilby is a mixed-race gang that originated in Worcester's other most notorious neighborhood, Maine South. I hope all my Worcester viewers are happy that I said it right this time. On my top 10 most gangster cities list, I called it South Maine. Oh my lord. Maine South over the years has developed a very bad reputation throughout the Bay State. I always heard about Maine South in programs or in jail. Decades before Mass Ave in Boston became an open-air market, Maine South was just that. Addicts from all over the city and the surrounding rural areas would flock to Maine South to be close to their supply. There was dealers, addicts, gangsters, women walking the streets. I guess recently the city has been trying to clean up the area and shake the stigma. But after decades of this kind of activity, it will take a while to change people's perceptions. Kilby Street at this point is now the biggest gang in Worcester and has enemies for days. A few years ago, Kilby actually replaced the almighty Latin Kings as the most dominant gang in the Worcester County Jail. The Latin Kings are the largest gang in the Massachusetts state prison system and dominate many county jails as well. I've read, though, in Worcester County that they've switched up and claim red on the inside, but not when they're out on the street. I don't know how accurate that is, if you guys want to help me out with that. Kilby was able to recruit new members while incarcerated, which has helped them to expand their territory upon the convict's release. The gang doesn't even hang out that much on Kilby Street anymore. Kilby Street itself is a much nicer and safer neighborhood than it was in the late 80s and early 90s when Kilby was formed, which makes it seem kind of odd to many residents why the city would want to change the name now that the area is much better. One of the gang's founding members, who now runs a non-profit, said the name change is counterproductive and would actually be inviting negativity back into the neighborhood. Besides Kilby Street nowadays, you're more often not to find Kilby members scattered throughout Maine South. They're kind of really all over the city now. I've read that they can be by the Lakeside Apartments, also on Eastern Ave. I don't know how accurate this stuff is, though. They have major problems with gangs on the east side. I've also read that they can be found in other neighborhoods like Grafton and Union Hills as well. Like I said, scattered throughout the city of Worcester at this point because they're so big. Bringing up the many ops of Kilby Street gives us a good segue for another interesting factor into the Worcester underworld. The city is also home to another notorious gang that originated in the Windy City, the Vice Lords. The Vice Lords are one of the most infamous gangs to come out of Chicago and have dominated the Midwest and beyond for decades. Although other powerhouse organizations have come to Massachusetts and flourished over the years from Chicago, like the Latin Kings and the GDs, Vice Lords aren't something you hear about in Massachusetts. I honestly didn't even know they existed until I started this channel and people started leaving comments about it. Now there is a question of whether or not this was a real Vice Lord set from Chicago or if it was just a Worcester creation. The Unknowns first began on Grand Street, and then a little while later they became the Unknown Vice Lords, and they were ops of Kilby Street. Now this is where the problem lies. There are many subsets of the Vice Lords, but there's no unknown set from Chicago. So a lot of people just think they simply added Vice Lord onto the end of the Unknowns, but it's not a legit set and not from Chicago. Apparently the Grand Street Vice Lords aren't the only Vice Lords set in the city though. Also on Canterbury Street, there's a set of the Insane Vice Lords. Now, the Insane Vice Lords are a legit set from Chicago. I'm not sure if they're tied in with them or not, but it's at least a real Chicago set. They refer to the Grand Street Unknowns as G Block and the Canterbury Insanes as C Block. I've also heard the name Infamous thrown in there somewhere as well, too. I don't know if that's connected to the Insanes or the Unknowns, but I've also heard Infamous Vice Lords before. It's just very interesting to me. I've never heard of a Vice Lord's presence in Massachusetts before this. One viewer told me that the guy who brought the Vice Lords to Worcester was a Vice Lord from East St. Louis. I'm not sure how valid that info is, but that's what I heard. Also, from what I hear, there's also some VLs in New Bedford trying to set up shop in a city that's been dominated mostly by Latin Kings and GDs. They've hooked up with a Latin King set called the Lane Gang. Besides the Vice Lords, there's also large red sets in the city, like the Lincoln family, aka the Link set, or the Lincoln Street Bees. They cover a large area on the north side of Worcester, all the way from Lincoln Park up Lincoln Street all the way to the valley. There's also a large set of red called the Eastern Ave Bees. Then on the west side, there's also a red set called OKC. So just to clarify and talk a little bit more about how I was saying it's Main South, the Kilby versus everyone. So some of the other gangs that are part of this Main South alliance that Kilby's a part of is also YKP, which is Young Kilby Posse. You got IKP, which is Insane Kilby Posse. You got MOE and FOE. Then there's a gang, I guess, that's derived from the 5%er Nation, which is a black Muslim gang that is very powerful in the New York prison system. It started like in the 1950s, but they're called the God Bodies, and they're Main South gang as well. And apparently, from what I read, they have some sort of connection to the 5%er Nation from New York. And then there's the Thoroughbreds, which is like a second generation gang of the God Bodies. This is from what I read, of course. And then, so other gangs in the city that I just want to say real quick before I move on to some other stuff. There's the Greendale Boys up on the north side. There was DDP. I don't know if a lot of these gangs that I'm saying how active they are now. From what I hear, some of them are, some of them aren't. But there was DDP, which stands for Dominicans Don't Play. There was also BDP, which was Bariquas Don't Play. I believe they were from more like the north side, closer to like the valley. There was different blue sets. There was CYC, LTC, and then of course ABZ, which is all over the state of Massachusetts. There was V Block on Vernon Street, H Block on Hollywood Street. The Goonies was an East Side red set. And I almost forgot to say the mega gang from Main South that Kilby's kind of like the head of. They all go like that's Kilby, YKP, IKP, MOEF, all the Main South gangs all together. I'm sure there's something that I'm missing as well, but they go under kind of this big banner of 3Z, and that's like what all the Main South gangs go under. But Kilby's the largest of them all, you know. So I try to do this. I haven't really been doing it as much lately, but I used to try to do this more in the videos. Is shout out some local kind of maybe not so well known rappers outside of their own city or the region in Massachusetts. So some of the rappers from the neighborhoods I've been talking about. A lot of these guys I saw on Jetpack TV, which shout out to them. I love their platform. They go around all over the place and give opportunities for local artists to get shown on their platform. Some of the guys from Main South that I like are D Gunna, Twisty, Little Bugs, and then there's some guys from Great Brook Valley up on the north side, Milano the Great, Jay Sav. There's another dude, I'm not sure exactly where in Worcester he's from, but I've heard a couple of his songs called 1600 Jaw. And then over on the east side, which is like Main South's ops, there's Yada Meech, Razor Hush, Blocks, and then also, of course, you can't forget Joyner Lucas, which is one of the biggest rappers that come out of Massachusetts at this point. So you gotta shout him out when you're talking about Worcester, because he's originally from Worcester. The street violence ebbs and flows in the city of Worcester. 2015 was a violent year in the city, and then it died down again until 2020 when violent crime rose by 31%. Crime all over the US rose during the pandemic, and it seems to have settled down in Worcester. Overall, for such a large city, Worcester is pretty safe. Even with the active gang beefs between Kilby and the East Side gangs, among others, Worcester is a much safer city than it was in the 80s and 90s. Unlike many other old industrial cities in central and Worcester, Mass. that have fallen on hard times, Worcester has actually adapted to the new age and has continued to grow. The city's population actually grew 28% from the 1990 census to the 2021, and its population is an all-time high right now. Worcester has changed its industries to fit the new age with biotechnology, medicine firms, and institutions for higher education. Worcester also has a vibrant new community of immigrants, giving the city diversity. In 2022, 23% of Worcester's population was foreign-born. Some of the major countries where people have immigrated from are Vietnam, Brazil, Albania, Ghana, and the Dominican Republic. It's a pretty good mix if you ask me. Worcester, like most large Massachusetts cities, is pretty diverse. White people make up just under 50% of the population, Latinos are 35%, black people are 12%, and Asians are around 7%. That's more or less comparable to other large Massachusetts cities, although many cities in the Bay State now have Latinos the majority. Like I said, overall, Worcester is a pretty safe city compared to the likes of Springfield, Mass, or Hartfield, Connecticut, the two most dangerous cities in New England. But there are still gangs and street violence in the city, just like any other place. Just this past year, horrific crime happened in the city when associates of Kilby Street went looking for an opposition member who had unalived a Kilby member years previous. Apparently, the associates sought out the man's sister. When they insisted that she give up her brother's location, she refused. They then went on to take the woman and her 11-year-old daughter's life because she would not cooperate. That's what I've read, but I've also seen things where the windows were rolled up and they were tinted, and possibly the people who did it didn't even know who was inside and it was a mistaken identity. So I really don't know, honestly. But it just goes to show when you get involved in the streets, it can affect more than just your own life. Worcester seems to be doing a good job at keeping the gangs at bay. Violence on the street has been down since 2020, and compared to other cities its size in the region, it's relatively safe. The main problem Worcester seems to be facing is its narcotics and homeless problem. Homelessness has been on a steady increase in the past few years, not just in Worcester, but everywhere. There's a couple different reasons for this. Obviously, narcotics use is a major one. Many people end up homeless because of their addiction, end up in places like Maine South to be close to their supply. But another major reason is the soaring rents and housing prices in the Bay State. While it's still a lot cheaper in Worcester than it is on the coast of Massachusetts, prices have still steadily gone up in Worcester, causing many people to lose their housing. As more and more people can't afford to live in the Boston area, cities like Worcester become more and more appealing, especially in a city where there's actually jobs and industry. But unfortunately, people moving west from Boston will just keep increasing the prices of houses and apartment rents. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I honestly knew very little about the Worcester underworld, so this was very interesting for me personally to learn a lot of this stuff. With that being said, I'm doing my best over here with the limited resources and time that I have, so please don't get too mad at me if I get some things wrong. As far as I can tell, I'm the only one out here trying to tell these stories about Massachusetts and New England that no one outside the region really even knows. People from all over the country think they know what Massachusetts is really like, but they don't know about the other side of the Commonwealth. Anyways, please hit up the comments and tell me what you thought, if there was things I forgot to cover, or if you'd like to see me cover in the future on the channel. But I did promise after the 10 most gangster cities in Massachusetts that I would do some Worcester content after so many people commented asking for it. So here you guys are. I hope you enjoyed it. And hopefully off the comments we can do some further Worcester content and dive a little bit deeper into some of the stories of the city. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like I said before, I really didn't know much about Worcester before I started doing this video. Certainly not much about the underworld or the street politics and gangs and stuff. So it was really interesting for me to learn a lot of this stuff. I don't really know many people out there, so I didn't get to talk to many people, and I tried to tread lightly, so hopefully I didn't offend anybody or upset anybody. You know, all the stuff I find is from me researching on the internet, so I have very limited time and resources, and I try to have a video coming out every week for you guys, so I do my best. So hopefully, like I said before, please don't get mad at me if I got a couple things wrong or if I said stuff I wasn't supposed to say. You know, I'm new to the Worcester scene. So anyhow, if you guys like the video, hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. We've been growing really fast lately. The channel's been doing awesome. Thank you guys so much. Hope everybody has a very happy Thanksgiving, which is coming up this week. Most of all, though, guys, you know what the spiel is. Make good choices, make good decisions, take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Try to have a nice day, guys. I'll talk to you guys real soon. God bless.